Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. So, funny story. When I was a young boy, I read a book called Catch-22. It was one that was on the shelf in my parents' house, and it had been there all my life, and I never actually paid it any attention. And then one day I decided, I'm going to read that. And that book ended up becoming my favourite book. It was Catch-22, as I said, by Joseph Heller. And I was totally blown away by it, by the weird, strange humour in the book. Like, it's all about insane bureaucracy and the twisted logic of the military, and all totally sent up and exaggerated, and how politics and that affects and how people go crazy and do daft things, and how people justify these things. And yeah, I kind of fell in love with it, just like Yossarian does in the very, very first line of the book. And years after that, I ended up picking up the film on DVD, the 1970s version, because they made an adaptation of it that had Alan Arkin and Art Garfunkel, Martin Sheen and Orson Welles in it. And it's got some flaws, but it's a pretty solid film. And it's not actually that bad an adaptation. And despite most of the actors being way too old for the roles, I mean they're all 10 years too old at least, it's still pretty good and quite unforgivingly stylized and interesting. But that was then, and this is now. And there's a brand new adaptation being made by George Clooney and Grant Heslov, who, they both act and produce as well as direct it. So without further ado, let's jump into this madness. So episode 1 throws the audience straight into the madness and confusion of World War II, as we see a blood-stained man walking through the dust and bustle of grounds crew frantically trying to put out an engine fire on a plane. And then it all builds up to a scream, and then it throws us back a few years to basic training, with that man, Yossarian, or Yo-Yo, and all his squadron pals, they're getting yelled at for not marching in an exact enough way. And his mate Clevenger can't help himself but answer a rhetorical question with what actually turns out to be the right answer, but anyway, they both get put on punishment. But life isn't too bad, because Yo-Yo's pretty good at the job. He's a bombardier, he's the one who drops the bombs out of the plane. And he's getting a bit of nuki off a cute blonde lady, and his pals seem to like him, even though he's quite often the voice of doom and gloom, pointing out the reality of how everything's nuts and how they're probably all going to die. And even when he tries to pass himself off as ill, the doc's kind of cool with it, because he understands where he's coming from, because he wanted to get sent home ill as well, but it didn't happen. And then finally the parade day arrives, and they're all really good, and the crowd and the general and his wife, oh right, that's who that is. Anyway, they all seem happy, until Clevenger ends up fainting, and again they both end up getting yelled at, and then they get put on punishment, again. And it's all good, because he's still getting his nookie, and he's still training hard, and a few weeks later, he's off in the thick of the war. But Yossarian knows his job, he fiddles with his knobs, waves at his mate, drops his bombs, flies back to base. Job done. 16 missions down, 9 to go. So the lads are chilling out, they wash, and they get a new bunk mate. Milo pops in to chuck them chocolate bars, and then Yo-Yo tells the FNG to where to sign in, but accidentally ends up telling them the wrong place to go, so he gets put straight on a plane and goes off into combat. And after that, it's chow time, and Yo-Yo meets a sergeant called Major. Yeah, really. And then House pops up, looking less than impressed, and Yossarian hears that the new guy, the new one in his tent, he got shot down and killed. Oh. And that clearly weighs on his mind. And he tries to get himself invalided out, but the nurse is absolutely having none of it, and neither is Dr. Nika, because it turns out he got transferred to the same airbase. And meanwhile, Milo has the bright idea of taking Major to Coverley, that's House, some lamb chops direct from Scotland, and promises to bring even more delicious foods if he can get him promoted to running the mess. And other than that, it's business as usual with the boys on the plane. I mean, the flak's a little worse than normal, but Yossarian knows his job, he fiddles with his knobs, he waves at his mate, and oh snap! And then, he drops his bombs and they fly back to base, a little shook. And the next day they get a brand new boss, Colonel Cathcart, and he's all about hoorah, and decides to raise the mission number from 25 missions to 30. At which point Yo-Yo runs straight to the doc and asks to be grounded for insanity. And the doc says, great, you're clearly mad. But by asking to be grounded, you just prove that you're sane. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because that's what Catch-22 is. And so with that, it's back off to another mission, with a bit of a heavy heart. So what did I think? Well, as I've said, I'm a massive fan of Catch-22. I mean, I absolutely love the book, and as I said, I absolutely love the 1970s Mike Nichols movie. And I'm going to try and put that to the side a wee bit, because, otherwise I'll just end up totally spending all the time saying, well, one did this and one did that, and I will compare them probably from time to time. But as I said, I'm going to tone it down. But one of the first things that struck me about it is the look of the show, because it's interesting that, they're actually both shot in a very similar way. Which makes kind of sense, because they're both shot in Italy with people wearing accurate Air Force clothes and uniforms and planes and everything. So you would expect that there's going to be a lot of similarity. But beyond like the visual stuff, it's noticing there's a totally different tone to this like show. And it's important to remember that Catch-22 was written in like the 60s, and the film came out in 1970, around about the same time as a similarly like war-themed black comedy movie called MASH, which you've probably seen. And both of them were like heavily influenced by the Korean War. I mean, actually, Joseph Heller said that he didn't actually, even though Catch-22 is set during World War II and was based vaguely on his experiences in the war, it's actually more heavily influenced by his reaction to the Korean War. And also, like, the fact that the films were very obviously influenced by the Vietnam War, which was raging at the same time. And both have a very kind of nuts and weary feel to them. So it makes sense that these two peas in a pod might feel similar in a kind of 70s way. But this Hulu show doesn't feel that way at all. I mean, it's quirky and crazy and it's a wee bit tongue in cheek, but this is very clearly a modern show. I mean, the 50 years that have come since the previous adaptation, they've obviously had an effect, and on how things are made and how things look and how things feel. And this is definitely a modern show in some ways, like, because modern audiences have a much better understanding of things like PTSD, and we've got a slightly different take on how we look at leadership and how idiots get into power. And even though that's basically the one of the main points of the novel, it's probably more pertinent now in a lot of ways in a lot of different countries. So I mean, in cinematic terms, also there's a very clear, definite harking back to stuff like the Pacific and Band of Brothers, as well as there's a lot of like Jarhead type stuff in this, and it'll be interesting to see if it goes on, if shades of other films start to show up as well. I mean, particularly like we've had a recent trend toward like self-questioning Iraq War movies recently, like The Hurt Locker or Green Zone or American Sniper. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if this doesn't sort of not literally reference those, but sort of feel similar in a way, because that's the tone and the mood of filmmaking of this kind of genre. But in terms of the show, I mean, I really love the actors. I thought they were fantastic. I mean, it's great to see people like George Clooney and Hugh Laurie and Kevin O'Connor. I mean, you maybe don't recognize Kevin O'Connor, but he was in The Mummy and he's been in tons and tons of movies. I mean, Clooney's doing this slightly bonkers routine that he's done in like Coen Brothers movies and stuff, and that's always great. But I'm really glad to see Kevin O'Connor in this because he's a totally underrated actor. I mean, he was in Hulu's last big sort of book adaptation, which was Stephen King's 221163, which is really, really good. It's one about the guy time traveling back to try and stop the Kennedy assassinations, and you should totally check that out. But he's an amazing actor, and he turns up in things like There Will Be Blood, which is an absolute masterpiece of a movie. And he's an actor who can hold his own in like scenes with like Daniel Day-Lewis and stuff, being as most Daniel Day-Lewis. So yeah, and also the young guys were great as well. I mean, a lot of these are kind of newish actors, which is an interesting point because the 1970 movie, as I said, the cast were almost entirely made up of actors who were in their 30s. But the characters in this squadron are actually only meant to be in their mid-20s because, their youth and their innocence and naivety are very much a part of the story. And there's a real, like, interesting line when Clevenger actually says,
"No, sir, I'm just innocent."
And he means in legal terms, but it's interesting because it kind of reflects the innocence of his character. And he's really honest and he just wants to do right. But as Yo-Yo points out, like Colonel Schweikhoff just wants him to like make himself look good and feel good by making this, all the troops do really pointless things like drill about because he's kind of a petty guy. And Yossarian himself is really good. Christopher Abbott is the guy who plays him, and he does a really good job of portraying him. Like he gets this balance of youthful vigor, but also cynical weariness. And I can't wait to see where he takes it. But there's also a grimness to the reality that undercuts all the humour in this, and it is actually quite funny. But thankfully, they've played down the humour a little bit, and they've played it up as a bit more serious. Because I mean, you've got stuff like what happens to Private Mudd, who literally ends up dying because he got sent to the wrong building by an offhand comment, and ends up getting mistaken for somebody else and thrown into a mission and dies. And then or the moment at the end of it where Yossarian's scratching the blood off the window. I mean, there's like a pointlessness to it. I mean, it's a ground war where the enemy are on the run, and they're still like bombing things just because their commanders want to be seen to be doing something, and that's a shame. But I mean, nothing's perfect, and I did have a couple of issues with it, but they were actually quite minor. I mean, some bits of the show did feel a wee bit clunky. I mean, especially some of the exposition, and presumably it's because there's so much stuff in the book, and it's quite a strangely written book. There's a lot of like little random bits of information thrown in left, right, and centre. So working that into the show is going to be difficult. So I mean, stuff like the bit of Major Major talking about how he got his name, that felt a bit random, but especially the way he tells it, you'd expect that, he'd be a bit more used to that kind of confusion and he would just tell people straight up, just call me Caleb, don't worry about it, ignore the rest. But instead he goes into the whole thing because it's a big chunk of the book and it just, or like, it's about a page and a half of it just talking about it. And another thing was like the repetitive nature of this episode. And I suppose that is kind of the point because, it takes a little bit to get your head round. It's like bombing run, swimming, eating, chatting, bombing run, chatting, swimming, etc., etc. And it's a bit like it reminds me a bit of the Amazon show Preacher. Now, ignoring what that's actually about because it's a lot to get into, there's a plot line where at one point you see Graham McTavish and he's like this cowboy. And it's told over several episodes. You get little snippets of his story of him going to get medicine for like his sick kid, and it takes ages. And then when he finally gets back after loads of things happening, it's too late, and he ends up going nuts and killing all the people that ended up holding him up and causing him problems along the way. And by the end of one of the last episodes of the first season, it shows that whole story again, like in a one-hour, and you're thinking, oh, okay. And then later in that same episode, you suddenly get another shorter version of it, and then a super faster one, and it gets shorter and shorter cuts of what happened, and it just feels a bit weird and grinding and strange. But then you realize eventually why it's doing it, and it makes sense. But that kind of grind, it's nothing like the same level as that, but for a first episode, that's a little bit slow and repetitive, especially considering how much stuff is going to happen in this book. So, I mean, I have to say it's a curious choice, but it may well pay off later. And another random thing, and this isn't really a problem, but I couldn't help feeling like Kyle Chandler, who played Cathcart, is kind of parodying George Clooney. I mean, it could be like, his opening speech actually reminded me of Clooney's wee scene at the end of The Thin Red Line, which is another fantastic movie. You should totally check it out. And as I said, it's not a bad thing. But I heard that George Clooney originally was supposed to play Cathcart, so it's clearly been written with that in mind. And it feels a little bit like Chandler is kind of aping him a wee bit. And that's about as far as you can get from the original, the previous adaptation version of Colonel Cathcart, who's very different. But yeah, I mean, the main issue with it, I think, and suspect people might not want to continue with, is it might feel a little bit slow to people, and it's not clear where it's going. And if you haven't read the book, but for me, I mean, I'm strapped in tight because I love this story and I know where it goes and all the crazy stuff that's going to come up, and I'm really curious to see what they leave in, what they take out, how they manage to get around some of the stuff, some of the more shocking stuff, and also some of the funnier stuff. But yeah, so till next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.